This is episode 78 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Wally, we can breathe again. The session is over. Doesn't mean it wasn't a very ugly session for the taxpayers, the economy, et cetera, and we will get to all the gory details, but blessedly, they are no longer in session.
The tsunami has subsided and the lawn furniture is floating out to sea along with children's toys and many other things, which in New Mexico, as you know, not a lot of water here. It's good that it is over. There were a few things that I thought were going to go through that didn't, but overall, pretty much all of the legislation that really could have been passed that reduced freedom, increased the size of government, boy, a lot of that got put in.
Yeah, I have to say that I was writing one of our fundraising appeals that go out in the late portion of March here. And when I started on my first draft with about a week and a half to go in the session, I actually wrote a pretty positive letter because we'd seen, unfortunately, the local right to work HB 85, that bill passed very quickly and banned local right to work. We knew the budget was going to be bloated and too much at 11%, but we hadn't seen a lot of the other really nasty bills getting the traction that we thought would happen. And kind of before we go into some of the gory details, kind of on a general comment side of things, the progressive leadership, especially in the House, but also in the Senate, and Peter Wirth and Brian Egolf can be called nothing but left-wing progressives. That's exactly what they are. And they governed in a very deliberate, very strategic, smart way that we haven't seen very often. Obviously, Democrats have controlled the legislature vast majority of either of our lifetimes and anyone listening to this podcast's lifetime. But they did things in a way that I think led to their ultimate success from a bad policy-making perspective. So I think there is a level of respect there for their acumen in kind of managing the legislative forces at hand and getting done what they wanted to do, even when it looked like the chips might be down for them.
Yeah, every bit of the progressive agenda did not pass, but every bit of it was put in a position where if they got the votes, it could have passed. And then very strategic with regard to the committee assignments, both in number and in which ones they were. So bills that were vetted in only two committees and one side or the other tended to get only one committee assignment on the other, and it tended to be the most remaining progressive committee in one of those. So a lot of things happened, and it largely sailed through. And one of the ones that really struck me was Senate Bill 489 in terms of the number of amendments that were offered in committee after committee after committee. And the fatal words by the sponsors was, "This is an unfriendly amendment," meant that it was going down to defeat. And there were, very few amendments to that bill that were accepted. It was, substantially what it was at the beginning.
Now, before I get ahead of myself and praise Egolf and Wirth to the heavens for their strategy, even if I disagree with it very strongly, it makes a world of difference to have a couple of seat cushion in each committee and be able to play with that both in the various committees in the House and Senate, but also on the floor where you have pretty overwhelming numbers. So it wasn't rocket science in a lot of respects, but they never compromised with themselves in those committees. Like you're saying, the unfriendly amendment, as soon as it got labeled with that, it was a kiss of death. Those bills came through the committee processes very cleanly, and then they negotiated among themselves on various pieces of legislation. And I'm talking about, in particular, two bills that I thought might do us all a favor and die, which were SB 2, that is the unlimited film subsidies. And that one, boy, I really thought that was going to make or break John Arthur Smith before the session, uncapping the film subsidies. That's a policy that he understands is not necessarily in the best interest of the state of New Mexico to keep shoveling $50 million annually and soon to be hundreds of million, more than $100 million annually at the film industry. And then uncapping it would have been further harm from a legislative perspective, trying to pass a budget. But they were able to get everybody into a conference committee and put together what I think is just abysmal policy to raise the film subsidy more than double, from $50 million annually to $110 million, and pay off a portion of the subsidy backlog. And I think John Arthur Smith, while not completely neutered or defanged this session, certainly the old warhorse is wearing down in terms of what he can or will do. He's still got that permanent fund, but that might be the only real stake he has in the ground at this point, Wally.
Yeah, and I do think that it looked to me, and who knows if this is right, but I do think that he saw the permanent fund as a long-term, irreversible thing that could go on for years and decades, and even make the hundreds of millions of dollars of the film subsidy look small. And so I do think he chose between the two to put his political capital behind that one. Yeah, the film subsidy is the idea that just keeps giving in New Mexico, and that we've got $100 million, and it'll be interesting to see what the backlog builds to now with that $100 million. So we paid a little bit of it off, which I guess is good news. It seems like it's always a good idea for government to pay its bills, but then we open the spigot at the top even wider for more to flow in there, and we'll see how much flows in there over the next year before they have to take a look at this again in Santa Fe.
Yeah, and the latest numbers were $383 million, I believe, in overall backlogs. The bill, SB 2, allowed for up to $225 million to be paid off for those film subsidies. And before we leave the film issue, there was a interesting back and forth in the Albuquerque Journal, and I hesitate to call it a litmus test, but the film subsidy program is the kind of policy that should be nonpartisan. If you understand the idea and the harm of literally writing checks to businesses in the hopes that they will come here, not even putting stakes in the ground. I mean, yes, Netflix now has bought a studio for a song, a fraction of the cost that it cost to build, but that is the first hard investments of the film industry in New Mexico. So to me, your perspective on the film subsidies is really a litmus test for, do you understand basic economics? Do you understand the principles? And have you read, say, Economics in One Lesson or some basic economics tract? And in the Albuquerque Journal, you had a back and forth. It's worth checking out. Dick Menzner is a Democrat and a former legislator, and somebody who I have a great deal of respect for personally, and especially from a knowledge of the New Mexico tax system. I'll tell the podcast listeners this story, as I'll tell you, Wally. I was speaking to a group, Oasis, here in Albuquerque. It's a kind of continuing education nonprofit for senior citizens. And this was during the days when real tax reform was actually on the table. And who shows up but Dick Menzner? And he enjoyed my presentation. I think he generally agreed with it. I wasn't talking, really partisan stuff at all. I was just, how do we reform this crazy New Mexico gross receipts tax? And Dick Menzner wrote this wonderful piece about yelling cut on New Mexico's film subsidy program in the Albuquerque Journal. It's very, very well done and worth a read for anybody who wants to check that out on abqjournal.com. And kind of telling you everything you need to know about New Mexico's business community, such as it exists. A response article was published days later by none other than Rob Black of the Association for Commerce and Industry, which to me has always been the sane Chamber of Commerce in New Mexico. Formerly, recently, Jason Espinoza, who I had a lot of respect for. Some other people have been involved with ACI that I'm not always super pleased with, but relative to the Albuquerque Chamber, they've always taken a pretty good line. They like their subsidies and their LEDA funds and the J-tips and those kinds of things, but they're at least, when it comes to the size of government, generally on the side of less government. But Rob Black, who comes to us from the Bay Area in California to replace Jason Espinoza with a IATSE, International Association of Theater and whatever, the film union. I don't know all the IATSE, what it stands for, but he co-authored this piece, 4 stars for expanded New Mexico film tax incentives. Now, I've met Rob. I think Rob is a generally sharp guy, but it says a lot when the New Mexico business community, especially the sane group within that community, is buying into film subsidies as a positive. And it really has guys like eGolf and Peter Worth and the Progressives and Lujan Grisham all with kind of the state where they want it. When you have people like the head of the statewide chamber jumping on board with what is just bad policy, it is an indicator that those folks have kind of won the day.
Well, the other thing, and you brought it up, what I was going to bring up is that the unions have tremendous power in New Mexico, notwithstanding the fact that there aren't a lot of union members here, particularly in the private sector. They invest heavily in these in statewide races. I think they're going to continue to invest in the primaries in coming years to try to take out the remaining moderate and potentially even slightly conservative Ds. This is one industry that actually is primarily unionized, and this is almost seems to me like the payback for all that union support coming in for the Democratic Party. This is the place that they are paid back. It's interesting. This industry, yes, the film incentives create jobs while they're here, but unlike things like economic development bonds and other things that are put into place, if permanent employment is not maintained, if the deal doesn't go long-term according to how it is, there's clawback provisions. That is not the case with film subsidies. You meet the requirements that year, you spend the money. It doesn't matter if you never do another deal in this state, if there's never any long-term economic development or industry growth development, you get that money. And that's the big difference.
Yeah, just to reiterate a point, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that noted socialist who celebrated when Amazon pulled out of the New York City deal recently, I said in a subsequent podcast that AOC would be right at home in the New Mexico legislature, especially the House, but there are many people like her in the Senate as well. And I would have taken Amazon and that deal any day and twice on Sunday over the film subsidy situation. And the fact that Rob Black can't or won't make that point is it says all you need to know really about New Mexico's current status politically and economically. So, we can recap some more of these bad ideas, bad legislation. Let's talk briefly about the Energy Transition Act before we get into some of the other things that passed. I know, Wally, that's been a cause celeb for us on this podcast, for folks in the Four Corners area. Kind of walk through as you see things, especially with respect to this deal that the city of Farmington came up with. Now, I know you've been talking to a lot of folks up there, as have I, but again, with the discipline that they had, the Brian Egolfs and the Peter Worths had with regard to the Four Corners. And, as an aside, very often in committees you hear, one interest group or one person gets up and they make a difference in the tone of a committee hearing. When there's no other dogs in the fight, you can make a difference in some of these meetings in Santa Fe. But when it is an ideological issue like this, and nothing was more ideological or is more ideological than the clean energy, allegedly, and the environmental groups, you can write an entire region of the state off the map, literally what they're basically doing. And they're happy to do it. They withstood any attacks from Four Corners politicians and anybody who stood in their way to shut down the Four Corners, the San Juan generating station, and do great economic harm to San Juan County. But what do you see happening to that power plant with the city of Farmington now in this kind of battle with the state of New Mexico? It's going to be an uphill struggle for Farmington at this point, both politically and economically.
Well, there's no doubt. And they as one of those, the messaging was slick, if nothing else, very slick. Nothing in this bill shuts down the San Juan generating plant. Everything is not directly, but practically it does. There's nothing in that. You can go ahead and apply to the New Mexico Environmental Improvement Board for some dispensation to go forward with this deal. Many times things like that take years and years and years on a deal that basically has months, a year at the most to be put together. So there's a lot of things that are like that. The Farmington folks say they still see a path forward and they're going to do that. But, like I say, the proof will be in the pudding. But when you put in a renewable fuel standard ramp up like they've done, absent any sort of stringent discipline from the Public Regulatory Commission with regard to cost, in all likelihood, rates will skyrocket just like they have in California. They were very careful in how they parsed their words to say they always would compare the San Juan plant to a hypothetical, or they would use a hypothetical industry-wide average as opposed to the actual numbers from the San Juan plant to say coal's it's not economical. In general, a brand new coal plant to build a brand new coal plant likely would be uneconomical, but this is not a brand new coal plant. This is a old coal plant that has a great deal of brand new pollution control equipment, and it's very well suited to continue to operate. Just in the Journal this morning, the environmental impact statement said, yeah, that plant could run based on current environmental rules, for 20 more years into the future, maybe beyond that. So all of these things are making a case, but the one that struck me is they just talk about how inexpensive renewables are. Renewables are cheaper, renewables are cheaper, renewables are cheaper. And the answer is absolutely renewables are cheaper when they run. And that when they run is a very huge factor because it means when they don't run, you need batteries, unproven technologically or economically, and there's some provisions in there for that, or you need nuclear, natural gas, or coal to make the whole system balance. And instead of taking a largely depreciated coal plant, they're going to be putting in new natural gas generation, and that it's going to be at a higher capital cost by far per megawatt hour than what it's replacing. And so they talked about all of these cost savings, and I didn't hear either from PNM talks about cost savings. Every committee hearing, the sponsors and their expert witnesses, cost savings, cost savings, cost savings. But I think it was an incomplete story. And I think we will see a lot of pressure on everyone, the PRC, the politicians who pass this. If we get what we believe will happen is a lot of rate increases. It's like a tax that does not go to the state. It's a tax that goes to a private entity, and it could be very hard on New Mexico in the years coming forward. And I have a belief that SB 489 will not stand in its current form forever. And the reason is there's two ways you can approach regulation. There's the solid conservative way, and it tends to be, not always, it tends to be that Republicans nationally and statewide, when they put in a regulation, they're pretty sure that existing and slightly improved future technologies can be used to comply with that regulation. Democrats, particularly the Obama administration and their EPA, they would put regulations in that there was no way industries could comply with them. And then at the 11th hour, they would pull those regulations back. In this case, because so much of this is in law, there is no 11th hour pullback. We may see some very bad things before the legislature deals with it again. And that's one of the huge potential big downside of that Senate Bill 489 that passed.
And it, just to be clear, Bill Richardson is the one who got the renewable portfolio standard to 20%, the renewable mandate. That was in the middle of his administration. So it's been about 15 years, or will be 15 years by next year, thereabouts, to get to 20% on the renewable mandate from 2020 to 2030. And, folks, I know, I trust me, I feel old just like all of you all out there. 2030 is kind of around the corner. It's a decade away from next year. And to be 50%, to go from 2020 or 20% to 50%, the easiest renewable energy to produce is that first wind turbine you put up, that first solar panel you put up. Everything after that is either less optimal or more expensive or less windy or whatever it might be. So getting from 20 to 50 is not going to be easy or cheap. And, I would just kind of backtrack on that Farmington issue. They're going to put up a fight, but they can't produce all of that electricity just for the city of Farmington. And with Farmington itself as a part of New Mexico, that renewable number at 50% is going to be very difficult for them to comply with, and for every utility provider to comply with if you use any coal whatsoever. So I suspect that unless they're able to appeal to court outside New Mexico, some kind of federal court or something, I don't see a path forward for the city of Farmington and their battle to keep the San Juan Generating Station open. But we'll see. It'll be an interesting thing to follow. The true impact of this legislation will not be felt for a few years as we move forward with the closure of the San Juan Generating Station, and then that real ramp up to solar and wind energy.
Well, and potential ramp back down, as we've seen places like Germany.
Exactly. So another group or issue that kind of felt the pain this session was local governments, especially rural local governments, where policies were enacted that when it fit the progressives' kind of desires, they struck down against local governments and their initiatives. Of course, right to work was one of those, minimum wage being another one. But we still have other policies that local governments have driven on the minimum wage, for example. When it suits the progressives' desires, they're more than happy to let those policies stand. But right to work, of course, is just something that's so big for the left that they are not going to allow that. And I think the point to really hammer this home is that in 2015, we needed 3 Senate Democrats to join the Republicans and support right to work. 3 Democrats in the Senate joined Republicans and opposed the ban on local right to work. It was John Arthur Smith, Mary Kay Papen, and Senator Clemente Sanchez. Those three, had they broken with Michael Sanchez in 2015, New Mexico could have been a right-to-work state, not just now, but for the last 4 years. So a certain level of leadership out of those folks in a losing cause. But unfortunately, local governance, it's really, what are you doing with those local powers now? That is the way the legislature and Lujan Grisham see this situation.
Well, and this comes up quite frequently with me on the podcast, is that if you look at right to work, again, a big union issue, and you would have to say that if this were a basketball game between the Harlem Globetrotters and the Washington Generals, the unions are the Harlem Globetrotters. They win almost every game. I think the Washington Generals lost won 2 games over a 20-year period, but that is a big predictor. On the minimum wage side, it's interesting because most of the population, either by law or by fact, is already way above what was passed in minimum wage. And by that, I mean Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Las Cruces already have minimum wage ordinances that are on the books that are well above what the statewide minimum wage was. And in places like Southeast New Mexico, the economy is the minimum wage. It's so much higher. Anything. You can't get someone to mow your lawn. And I talked to a few people at Hobbs at the New Mexico Activities Association basketball tournament about the economy, and they confirmed, yes, things are wild and crazy. High school kids can get jobs making $15 an hour at the drop of a hat. They're looking for people to work. But now they went and imposed that on places like, Raton and Tucumcari. One of the few people that actually spoke out directly against it was Matthew Gonzalez, a trustee of Cimarron, that just talks about the economy up there just can't handle it. And and again, back to that economics and one lesson, I did listen to more of those hearings than I care to, but basic economics isn't necessarily widely understood in those communities, among legislators, or they know it and they just don't care. They have their talking points. They're going to read them. They had the power. On to the next vote. Yeah,
and this is one that, again, I thought with a week or so in the session, we might be saved from this bad policy. It's one of the governor's main talking points during her campaign. She wanted to take it to $12 an hour on the minimum wage. Clemente Sanchez, state senator, what passes for a moderate these days in Santa Fe, said $11. He did pull out tipped wages, did not have a CPI, so no automatic increase on that. But still, ultimately, he got rolled on the rate, so the governor took it to $12 an hour. So we're 60% increase in the minimum wage. Now it's 2023, I believe, is the year. So it got pushed out slightly. Doesn't matter. Your mom and pop in Springer, New Mexico, or Gallup, it doesn't matter how many years you put on this thing. The ability for them to come to grips with the $12 an hour minimum wage is going to be very circumscribed. It's going to be very challenging for them, especially if, God forbid, the U.S. economy or even the oil and gas industry here in New Mexico take a plunge, because right now we're in go-go times. If you go around the country, everything is popping in economically prosperous areas of our country. You see cranes and buildings going up. In New Mexico, we're just finally staggering out of the Great Recession of a decade ago, and the legislature is pushing some of these struggling communities back into just tougher and tougher economic times. So the bill that passed was better than the House originally wanted. I was hoping that they could not come to an agreement, but when it came to bad policy this year in Santa Fe, agreement was definitely found on a variety of issues that just are going to be huge problems for this state moving forward. So those are some of the big economic policies that we've touched on. Now, Wally, the Electoral College, we talked to Trent England a few weeks ago on the podcast here, and he was fighting with the Rio Grande Foundation. He's a fellow. He's out of Oklahoma, but he was trying to advocate for why the Electoral College is worth preserving. That one passed. Same-day voting registration, which just strikes me as completely insane. How do you even do same-day voting in a mail-in ballot like we have had just recently in Albuquerque? I don't even, that doesn't compute with me. And just public policy after public policy in this state, really, it was made with very little thought, I think, to the real world.
Well, and I've observed over the last decade, and in both parties, in the federal Congress, both the House and the Senate, but particularly in the House members have been much more representatives of the party they represent than of the states they represent. And I think we are starting to see that in a big way in New Mexico as well, in that a lot of these policies, and the Electoral College is a classic one. That's a national Democratic issue, but I just cannot see logically how you argue it's a good thing for New Mexico to take the power that was granted to it in the Constitution in terms of what the Electoral College does, and have us throw in with New York, Illinois, and California that are consistently very much vote on the Democratic side, and that there you have it. So it's like you don't even need to vote for president if this thing goes through on a nationwide basis. It'll be taken care. Your vote will be cast for you in another state.
It is amazing the way that on some of these issues, and I think this gets back, unfortunately, to the lack of education of voters and the just ignorance of the general population. And it's not just here in New Mexico. I think this is a nationwide problem where people are much more inclined towards the red team, blue team mentality than they are towards what is actually good for me as a citizen of New Mexico or my state. And the Electoral College is one obvious issue that benefits New Mexico to the extent that anyone has a vote that matters in a presidential election as an individual vote. The votes at the Electoral College for New Mexico give us a seat at the table. And yeah, Californians, I get it. If you're in California, they don't want the Electoral College. By all means, they want to get rid of it. First and foremost, because Californians, especially on the progressive left, those people fund the Democratic Party. You track the money coming into the Democratic Party, and they get it from a lot of those tech tycoons out of California. New Mexico, we're not just going to have a vote that's reduced in value, but really the money, when you look at a U.S. political campaign for president, we're not a money source for a lot of those folks. Yeah, sure, you'll get some Republicans donating out of the oil patch, and those are some big name guys, but the amount of money that's to be had in New Mexico to bring any presidential candidate here and the votes, it's not going to be a place that too many presidential candidates are going to darken our doorsteps anytime in the near future.
No, and if this goes through, one group that ought to be squarely against that is if you're, just to throw a couple names out there, if you're KOAT TV or News Radio KKOB, odds of money coming in advertising wise under this regime are very slight. Why would you do it? Just put more money in California, run up the popular vote total, and you'll get New Mexico in the deal. So,
well, now you're actually saying things that make me halfway supportive, because if we can take one entire level of political advertising off the table, then it actually sounds kind of good there, Wally. Now, is there any way we can do an Electoral College for the U.S. Senate and for the House?
Oh, yeah.
Because we might as well at this point not vote anyway, because the progressive left is going to control this state for the foreseeable future, as it seems to stand now. I being somewhat facetious, not entirely, but
let's just let the president appoint our senators. That would be the solution. Let's just go to a single government, and we can call them king or queen too, just to make it interesting. All right, enough of that from
Yes,
me.
Wally. Well,
I'm self-censoring.
folks can go on to our Freedom Index, riograndefoundation.org for check out the Freedom Index, the votes. All the gory details are available on there. And yeah, I hate to say it, it is pretty ugly and gory. And the votes show it. There are a lot of negative numbers on the Freedom Index. A lot of folks had really bad voting records. And we'll be talking in our next podcast with Paige McKenzie, who tracked all this. She had the unwelcome duty of looking through all of these horrendous votes. But as it stands now, and these are not final numbers, this could change, but currently Representative Candy Ezell rose to the very top of the House, and that was the entire, both bodies. She won the whole thing. Rod Montoya, Representative Larry Scott. Senator Mark Moores made a late push, becoming the only Republican, only senator with a positive track record in this session, but he managed to win the Senate for all voters. And you had some truly astonishing vote totals and negative points. Joy Garrett, I believe she is on the west side of Albuquerque. She, quote unquote, won with a minus 383 point total. She voted correctly an astonishing 20.6% of the time, which she was beaten out by Cheryl Williams Stapleton, who's perpetually at the bottom of these indices. She's terrible. Stapleton is. I'll give Joy Garrett a chance. She's, I think, a freshman, so this is her first opportunity here. But Damon Eli, who showed his true colors by sponsoring HB 85 to ban right to work at the local level. Deborah Sariñana, Eliseo Alcon, Christine Chandler. So the list goes on, but these were some of the very lowest number in terms of their votes in the Rio Grande Foundation's Freedom Index. It was a very tough session for individual liberty, and the Freedom Index clearly illustrates why that was.
Yeah, and I don't think that, Paul, you reiterate this point enough, not just because it's so ingrained in you, is why is this important is economic freedom correlates so highly to economic success and prosperity that I'm sure there are people that would debate it, but the data is not there to support that. And so these are the things that are very important for economies to thrive. And because New Mexico's not thriving, that's why we're spending so much time, money, and effort to look at these items.
Yeah, and hopefully at some point it'll break through in people's brains. As I've said before, we at the Rio Grande Foundation have participated in and often led successful ballot campaigns. When people actually vote on an issue, they don't seem to be the same folks that vote for the politicians that represent them in the legislature. You see a soda tax, vote against it. You see mandatory paid sick leave, vote against that. And an APS tax grab, you vote against that. But then you put politicians in office, and it's not just this legislature. It's APS school board. It's school boards around the state. It's PRC, other governing bodies around our state wind up being dominated, city councils and mayor's offices in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. All these folks are governing with basically the same economic philosophy in mind, which is against economic freedom, against prosperity, against the growth that drives our economy forward in the United States. It's driven Texas to be a very prosperous state, Arizona to be much more prosperous than we are, Colorado as well. The number of states that have succeeded, whether it's the United States or around the world, it's all based on economic freedom. And I hate to say, we're turning into Venezuela. We probably can't turn into Venezuela for the simple fact that as much as the Federal Reserve and the U.S. federal government are not necessarily the best at managing things like inflation and the financial soundness of our government, Venezuela has just completely gone off the deep end with socialist economic policies. But it should be a harbinger, a canary in the coal mine, a thing that we look at as a cautionary tale and say, Venezuela is what happens when nations embark upon socialistic policies. And we don't want to be like Venezuela. We want to be like the countries and the states that succeed economically with economic freedom.
Without a doubt. And if I could close with my kind of 6 leading indicators, we've done on an earlier podcast how New Mexico's basically had a lost decade relative to all of our neighbors around it. And I've come up with my 6 candidates for that. Why is that? In no particular order. The minimum wage, we've had it. They see it doesn't hurt. Well, something's hurting our state. The gross receipts tax, horrible tax. They've really not been able to address that, made it worse over the past decade. Education, we've struggled. We put a lot more money in it. Achievement's not there. Crime, I think this session we actually might have made crime worse in terms of we weren't trying to figure out how to prevent it. We're worried a lot more about how to let people off the hook who have committed crime, but let's call that's not a strong one. The final is cumbersome regulatory structures that exist in New Mexico. Very little was done to make that better. A lot was done to make that worse. And the only one that really isn't legislative, and this one goes way back, that I really do think continues to hurt New Mexico to this day, is that in the 2008 time period, when the economy went to heck in a handbasket, they raised the unemployment tax rate up so high on those existing employers. I still come across small business people on a weekly basis that say, hey, I learned my lesson in 2008. I'm not hiring anybody unless things get so good. I know they'll be around forever. So, those are all things that are impacting New Mexico, and we're going to have to figure out how to do something with that. Not a lot of progress made to the good this time, but hope springs eternal.
That's all we have. That's all we have. Well, I will end this on a semi-positive note, which is that the one industry that is the basis for New Mexico, unfortunately, the policies enacted this session make us even more reliant than we previously were on this one industry, and one industry that, generally speaking, escaped most of the worst of the bad policies coming out of Santa Fe is the oil and gas industry. And, in some respects, you could argue that SB 489 and the Energy Transition Act was enough red meat for the environmental groups that they didn't need to focus on the oil and gas and go after them as hard as they might in a normal session. But on the other hand, you might say, well, the Democrats love that green money. That's their kind of green. So we'll see what the future holds for oil and gas. They are certainly still in the sights of New Mexico's legislature and the forces of big government. But for this session, our largest and most important industry as a state escaped without too much in the way of policies inflicted upon them. So that is, I guess, the one thing we can all hang our hats on. Ironically, of course, as the Democrats talked about how they wanted to diversify our economy, what they did is simply make us more reliant on oil and gas. And hopefully for our sakes, that prices don't drop from below oil, and we see continued growth in that Permian Basin. So that is it, folks. We will talk about happier things in the future, which is anything besides New Mexico legislative session. Thanks for listening to this week's discussion. We're working every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to RioGrandeFoundation.org for more information or to support our work.